So I promised you a treat. I promised you that we'd get to meet the forkers. And we have a number of forkers with us over the next couple of days. When you get outside and you get to see all the amazing tables, we've got tables from OpenTOFO, OpenBOW, Valkey, and OpenSearch, which is just fabulous. You know, so 4 of the key forks. And what we've seen in this business challenge is we've seen a shift. And the shift that we've seen is that forking, which was always the nuclear option, might actually be something that's usable to manage the future of open source and businesses and stop this license shift. So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to start by talking to Dawn Foster, or Dawn Foster's going to talk to us. And Dawn is what is your title? Director of Data Science? Dawn is also director on my board. And she is one of the most knowledgeable people about open source in the world, but she goes really deep and dives into the data. So we're going to let Dawn tell us a bit more about how the forking landscape has changed. Dawn.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. So recently, we've seen some pretty high-profile open source projects relicensed by companies after pressure from investors to increase profitability. And several have led to forks. So keep in mind, there is no perfect data for understanding the impact of relicensing and forks, but understanding the company dynamics within these projects is absolutely critical. You'll see on the next few slides that I've started with commits plus lines added and deleted, which misses loads of other important types of contributions. So I'll say that right now. This is really just a start. And we actually plan to look at other health metrics for these projects in future phases of the research. So this is phase 1 of a much larger project. So starting with Elastic, Elastic moved Elasticsearch under a couple of non-OSI approved licenses in 2021. And as you'll see on the next slide, almost all of the existing contributors to Elasticsearch were Elastic employees. So the relicense really didn't have an impact on contributors, since there were just very few of them. But there was a pretty big impact on some users of Elasticsearch who had to decide whether they could use it under one of these licenses. So this resulted in a decision at Amazon to fork Elasticsearch into a new project called OpenSearch, so they could give their customers an alternative to Elasticsearch, which you'll hear a lot more about in the next presentation. But for Elasticsearch, so here's the data. For Elasticsearch, I'm comparing the year before Elasticsearch relicensed, when it was under the Apache 2.0 license, with the following year, when Elasticsearch was no longer open source. So you can see that it just made very little difference, right? Because Elastic never built a strong contributor community outside of their employees. So the contributions came from employees both before and after that relicense. So in the OpenSearch example, I'm comparing the early days of the OpenSearch fork, so the first year, with the most recent year, up until with a cutoff date of when Amazon moved it into the Linux Foundation. So in that first year, a lot of work was being done by just a few Amazon employees. In the most recent year, you can see that this is gradually shifting to bring in more contributors, and they've made governance improvements that allowed them to move it into the Linux Foundation and allowed more people to contribute. So I'm super interested in rerunning this analysis after they've been in the Linux Foundation for 6 months or so. Now, most Terraform contributions were also made by HashiCorp employees, even when it was an open source project. So this is very similar to Elasticsearch. However, you'll see that the fork is very different from OpenSearch. The OpenTOFO fork was started under the Linux Foundation, so from the start, it was under a foundation rather than a company. So similar to the Elasticsearch example, you can see that the HashiCorp employees made almost all of the significant contributions to Terraform, even before the relicensing, with few people outside of the company making any kind of significant contributions. So it's not surprising that it's pretty much the same after they relicensed. OpenTOFO, on the other hand, has a really diverse set of contributors from a variety of companies. However, it's also interesting to note that none of these contributors made any significant contributions to Terraform before the fork. So they were basically starting from scratch under the Linux Foundation. Now, this is a very different example. So in this case, there were a lot of contributors to Redis who weren't employees of the company. Redis had said they were never going to change their license, they'd always be open source. And then when Redis did move to non-open source licenses, these contributors forked the project and started a new project called Valky. And the new project was also started under the Linux Foundation. So from the start, it was under a neutral foundation. Now, where the Redis project differs from Elasticsearch and Terraform is in the number of contributions from people who were not employees of Redis. So in the year leading up to the relicense, when Redis was still an open source project, there were substantial contributions from employees of other companies. In the 6 months after the relicense, all of those contributors, external contributors from companies like Amazon, Tencent, Huawei, and Ericsson, who contributed to the Redis project in the year leading up to the fork, they stopped contributing to Redis. So all of the contributors who made 5 or more commits after the relicense were Redis employees. Valky had 29 people at 10 companies in the first 6 months of the fork. And 18 of those people previously contributed to Redis. So you can see that there's a diverse group of contributors from a wide variety of companies who are building Valky. Vendors are under pressure from investors, and some are relicensing their popular open source projects in the hopes of increasing profitability. And the forks that result from these relicensing events actually tend to have more organizational diversity than the original projects, especially when they're created under a foundation rather than a company. And projects with greater organizational diversity tend to be more sustainable over time. So it's still too early to understand the ultimate success or failure of these projects, either the original or the fork. It remains to be seen over the longer term if these types of forks might actually become more sustainable than the original projects if any of these vendors continue to struggle to meet the expectations of their investors. And with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to Amanda.
Thank you.